The gavel came down like a verdict. The sound cracked through the gold-soaked air of the Obsidian Club's inner hall, sharp, final, obscene, and for one suspended heartbeat. Every tuxedo in the room turned. Not toward the stage, toward her. Sylvia Kern stood at the back of the room with her wallet clutched to her chest. Her heart hammering so loud, she was sure the man on the platform could hear it. The chandeliers blazed above her, dripping amber light across the crowd of billionaires and warlords and men whose names moved markets, and not a single one of them had raised a hand. She had. What's happening up there? She had whispered to herself when she'd first pushed through the wrong door, still holding a tray of untouched champagne flutes, still pretending she was just a caterer who had taken a wrong turn. The murmur in the room had an ugly texture, something between excitement and dread, that made the fine hairs on her arms rise beneath her silk uniform. Then she saw him, at the center of the raised platform. Flanked by two men built like industrial doors, stood a figure that did not belong in chains. He was tall, impossibly so, his black suit jacket hanging open, white shirt half undone at the collar as if even the fabric had given up trying to contain him. His dark hair was swept back, disheveled in that specific way that meant something violent happened tonight. His wrists were bound in front of him with steel restraints, and he wore them the way other men wore watches, like they were nothing, like he was the dangerous one. His face gave nothing away, no fear, no rage, just a stillness so absolute it made the room around him seem like it was the thing vibrating out of control. His eyes dark, measuring, cold as a blade left in winter water, moved slowly across the crowd. Not searching, cataloging. "Gentlemen," the auctioneer announced, straightening his lapel with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You know what you're looking at. You've all heard the name." He paused, letting the silence do the work. Gan Hyun-Shik. The name landed like a stone in still water. Sylvia watched the ripple move through the crowd, the almost imperceptible lean backward, the sudden interest in cufflinks and whiskey glasses, the careful blankness that fell over faces that had negotiated wars without blinking. They're afraid of him, she realized. Every single one of them. The dragon of the Geom-In has fallen. The auctioneer continued, his voice carrying the particular delight of a man who had survived long enough to watch legends crumble. His enemies have generously made him available for acquisition. Starting bid is he named a number. Silence. Not the polite considering silence of an auction. The no one wants to be the one who buys a tornado silence. Because everyone in this room understood the arithmetic. Buying Hyun-Shik meant his syndicate would come for the buyer. It meant inheriting his war. It meant signing your own name on a death warrant in someone else's blood. The auctioneer let the silence stretch. Then he laughed softly. "Come now. Surely someone." That was when Gan Hyun-Shik's eyes stopped moving. They found her. Across the entire gilded, terrified room, through the blur of tuxedos and crystal and chandelier gold, his gaze landed on Sylvia Kern, nursing student, part-time caterer, woman who had absolutely no business being in this room and stayed. She didn't know why her hand went up. She would ask herself that question for the rest of her life and never find a satisfying answer. Maybe it was the healer in her, the same reflex that had pulled her toward every person she'd ever seen, bleeding on a curb or crying in a hospital hallway. Maybe it was the money burning a hole in her wallet, the $1,200 she'd saved to buy herself a bus ticket out of this city, and the memory of what she'd seen 3 months ago in a parking garage, a memory that had been chasing her through her sleep ever since. Maybe it was just that he looked like a man about to be slaughtered, and she had never in her life been able to walk past that. Her hand rose. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. $1,200. The silence that followed was a different species entirely. Then the room erupted not in bidding but in staring. Heads swiveled. Whispers ignited. The auctioneer's smile froze, cracked, and rearranged itself into something caught between amusement and disbelief. He looked at her, really looked, at the cream silk uniform dress, the wide eyes, the wallet pressed to her chest like a shield, the bills visibly sticking out the top, and laughed. But his hand was already moving. The gavel hit the block. Sold. And Gan Hyun-Shik, the most feared man in the city, looked at Sylvia Kern with an expression she couldn't name, something between dark amusement and the first flicker of something that would take her weeks to identify as recognition, and said nothing at all. He didn't have to. The guards were already moving to release his wrists, and Sylvia Kern, still clutching her empty wallet to her chest, her knees shaking beneath the delicate pleats of her dress, suddenly understood with absolute clarity that she had not just bought a man, she had bought a war. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. If you're already hooked on Sylvia and Hyun-Shik's impossible story, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell, because the next chapter, it's going to be absolutely insane. Comment below, are you Team Sylvia, or do you think she should have taken the money and run? Their world is about to get a whole lot more dangerous, and their love is about to face its deadliest test yet. Don't miss what happens next. The guard reached Hyun-Shik first. He was a large man, the kind built specifically for rooms like this one, and he moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had transferred human property before. He produced a key from his breast pocket, fitted it into the lock on the restraints, and turned it with a click that Sylvia felt in her back teeth. The steel fell away. The atmosphere in the room changed before Hyun-Shik even moved. It was like watching a pressure drop before a storm, that invisible, electric shift that every animal instinct in the human body is wired to recognize as danger. The men nearest the platform took a half step back without seeming to realize they'd done it. Somewhere to Sylvia's left, a woman in diamonds pressed herself against her companion's arm. Hyun-Shik rolled his wrists once, slowly, like a man waking up a machine he'd simply switched off for a while. Then he turned and looked directly at Sylvia. She had expected rage. She had expected the hollow, broken stare of a man who had been through whatever tonight had put him through. She had braced herself, in the 3 seconds between the gavel and this moment, for gratitude or fury or shock, some human emotion she could work with. Something she could respond to the way she'd been trained to respond to patients coming out of crisis. What she got was none of those things. What she got was amusement. Not warm amusement. Not the kind that crinkled eyes and invited you in. The dark, private kind, the kind that lives in the space between a predator spotting something unexpected and deciding what to do about it. His gaze moved over her in a single sweep. The cream silk dress, the wallet, the champagne damp hem, the shaking hands. Then, it returned to her face and stayed, and Sylvia had the sudden, disorienting sensation of being the most interesting thing in a room full of extraordinary things. He stepped down from the platform. The guard who had freed him moved to intercept instinct or protocol. It didn't matter. And Hyun-Shik stopped him with nothing more than a look. The guard went still, then stepped aside. He crossed the distance between the platform and Sylvia in the kind of unhurried, deliberate walk that made the crowd part without him ever asking them to, and he came to stand in front of her close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to hold his gaze. He smelled like expensive cologne that had survived something terrible. His jaw was set, his eyes were unreadable, and he dipped his head slightly, just enough to bring his voice to the level of her ear. "You have no idea what you've done," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with an accent that lived somewhere between Korean precision and the flattened vowels of a man who had spent too many years in too many countries. It was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was simply a fact, delivered with the calm certainty of someone reading a weather report. Sylvia's mouth opened. She had a response somewhere, something reasonable about how she had simply reacted, how she just needed him to walk away and not look for her afterward, how the $1,200 was everything she had, and she would appreciate it if he could just... The first gunshot came from the left side of the room. She didn't even register the sound as a gunshot at first. Her brain cataloged it as something breaking, a champagne flute maybe, and she was already turning toward it when Hyun-Shik's arm came around her waist like a steel beam and yanked her backward into his chest so hard the air left her lungs. The second shot she recognized. The third she felt. Not hitting her, but skimming his left arm. the way his body absorbed the graze just slightly, just enough to register as a flinch that most people would have missed. He didn't make a sound. He tucked her tighter and moved. What happened in the next 40 seconds, Sylvia would later only be able to reconstruct in fragments, the way the mind processes events that are moving faster than it can file them. She knew that Hyun-Shik moved her behind the nearest pillar with a precision that felt like choreography. She knew that he turned back toward the room. She knew that 2 of the platform guards converged on him simultaneously, and that he took them apart with his bare hands in a sequence so efficient it looked less like violence and more like problem-solving, a series of controlled, devastating decisions made at speed, each one following the last with the cold logic of someone who had done this so many times it had become its own language. The room descended into chaos, screaming, the scrape of chairs. Somewhere, the chandeliers flickered. A third guard raised his weapon, and Hyun-Shik closed the distance on him before he could fire, stripped the gun, and put the man on the floor in a single motion. He stood in the center of the carnage black jacket, white shirt open at the collar, hair slightly more disheveled than it had been 60 seconds ago, and turned to face what remained of the room. His voice, when he spoke, carried easily over the noise. "She bought the ticket," he said. "She takes the ride." He reached back, found Sylvia's wrist in the dark behind the pillar, and pulled. She ran because there was nothing else to do. Her heels came off somewhere near the service corridor. She didn't stop for them. Hyun-Shik moved ahead of her, and she followed the shape of him through the back hallways of the Obsidian Club, through a kitchen that erupted in shouts as they crashed through it, down a stairwell that smelled like cold concrete and old money, and out through a fire exit into the night air of the city. The car was a black Bentley parked at the building's private entrance, engine running, driver's door open, and the driver conspicuously absent, fled or felled. Sylvia didn't ask. Hyun-Shik got behind the wheel. She threw herself into the passenger seat and barely had the door closed before he pulled out into traffic with the serene, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life been unsure of his next move. She pressed herself against the window and tried to breathe. "You've been grazed," she said. Her voice came out remarkably steady, which surprised her. "Nursing school," she thought distantly. "You learn to function in the red. Your left arm. I need to look at it when we stop. I need to drive." He changed lanes without signaling, cutting between a taxi and a delivery truck with millimeters to spare. "You need to breathe." "I am breathing. You're hyperventilating. There's a difference." She clenched her jaw and looked out the windshield at the city lights blurring past. She could see in the side mirror that a car had pulled out behind them too, actually, moving with intentional speed. Hyun-Shik had seen them too. She could tell by the way his hands shifted on the wheel, a barely perceptible redistribution of attention. He drove the way he did everything, with a cold, deliberate precision that left no room for panic. Cutting through the financial district and doubling back through the warehouse quarter, using the city's grid the way someone uses a map they memorized years ago and have never forgotten. By the time they reached the waterfront, one of the trailing cars had been lost to a red light he'd run, and the other had fallen far enough behind to be theoretical. He parked the Bentley at the end of a private dock and got out without a word. Sylvia sat in the passenger seat for 3 full seconds, staring at the steering wheel, cataloging everything that had just happened to her in the last hour, and finding that none of it fit in any category her brain had previously prepared for it. Then she got out. The boat was already there, a sleek, dark vessel tied to the end of the dock that had the particular anonymity of something purchased for disappearing. Hyun-Shik stepped aboard and looked back at her. He hadn't offered a hand. He wasn't going to. But he was waiting, which was, she was beginning to understand, probably the closest he came to asking. She stepped onto the boat. The city lights receded behind them as he navigated out into open water, and Sylvia sat at the bow with her ruined dress and her empty wallet, and the slowly solidifying understanding that she was not going home tonight. The island appeared out of the dark about 40 minutes later, a shape rising from the water, lit at its center by the low, warm glow of a structure that resolved, as they drew closer, into something that looked less like a safe house and more like an architectural statement. Glass and steel and clean angles, set back from a private dock among trees that swallowed most of the light. The kind of place that didn't exist on maps that ordinary people used. Hyun-Shik tied off the boat and stepped onto the dock and then stopped. Sylvia was beside him in an instant, because she had seen enough people try to push through blood loss to recognize what a man's legs looked like in the 3 seconds before they stopped cooperating. The graze on his arm had bled more than she'd been able to assess in the car. The sleeve of his jacket was dark with it, and she got her shoulder under his arm before he could argue, his weight settling against her with the reluctant gravity of a man who had never learned how to accept help and was currently running out of alternatives. "I'm fine," he said. "You've been grazed by a bullet. You have drugs in your system, something dissociative by the look of your pupils. The kind they use when they need a dangerous man compliant but upright. You've been in restraints for God knows how long, and your blood pressure is dropping," Sylvia said, her voice going clinical, gone certain the voice she used when she knew something the patient didn't want to hear. "So you're not fine, but I can make sure you don't get worse, which is what I'm going to do now, so please stop arguing with me and walk." A pause. "You argue with dangerous men often?" "I argue with patients. You qualify." Something shifted in his expression too fast for her to catch what it was, and then he let her take more of his weight, and they walked together toward the house. She spent the next 4 hours not sleeping. The house had a first aid room rather than a kit, which told her something about the kind of people who used this place and the kind of evenings they typically had. The graze was clean, a furrow along the outer muscle of his upper left arm, ugly but not deep, not the kind of wound that would kill a man if treated properly. She cleaned it, closed it with butterfly strips, monitored him through the worst of the drug withdrawal, which hit properly around 3 in the morning, and which he endured the way he endured everything, without sound, without complaint, his jaw set and his eyes fixed at some middle distance she couldn't see into. And in the blue-gray hours of early morning, while his breathing finally evened out and the worst of it passed, Sylvia sat on the edge of a chair and looked at him the way she was allowed to look when he wasn't looking back. The jacket was gone. She'd cut away the sleeve to access the wound. What she'd found beneath had stopped her hands for a moment before her training pushed her back into motion. Scars. Not 1 or 2. A topography of them old ones, silver and settled, newer ones still carrying color, a record of a life that had involved a profound and sustained amount of pain. She had learned, in nursing, not to make stories out of patients' bodies, but she was not quite in a hospital, and he was not quite a patient, and the map of damage across his skin told her something about the man that his face, in its careful blankness, had been designed to conceal. He had survived a great deal. She pulled a blanket up across his chest and went to sit by the floor-to-ceiling windows and watch the water lighten from black to gray to the pale silver of early morning, and she thought about the $1,200 she no longer had, and the bus ticket she was no longer going to buy, and the city she had not escaped, and whether any of this was as catastrophic as it felt, or whether she was simply too exhausted to find the version of events in which she came out fine. She was still sitting there when she heard him move. She knew he was awake. Before she turned around, the quality of the silence in the room changed, went from the empty quiet of an unconscious person to something that had attention in it, awareness, the particular texture of a space that is being observed from within. She turned slowly. He was sitting up. He had found a shirt left folded on the nightstand, dark, plain, already in the house, and pulled it on but left it open, his hands loose in his lap, his eyes on her. The bruising along his jaw was darker in the daylight. The pallor from the drugs was still there, gray at the edges, but his gaze had recovered its precision entirely. He watched her with a focused, measuring calm, as if the intervening hours of withdrawal and wound care had not happened, or had simply not been sufficient to alter his fundamental nature. He didn't say good morning. He said, "Come here." Not a request, not quite a command either, more like a simple statement about what was going to happen next. Sylvia stood up from the chair by the window, and because she was either brave or too tired to be appropriately afraid, She walked across the room and stopped an arm's length away from where he sat on the edge of the bed. He looked up at her. Why? Why what? Don't. His voice was flat. You know what I'm asking. She did. She had been asking it herself for the last 4 hours, and she still didn't have an answer that satisfied her, so she gave him the only one she had. I saw a man who was about to be sold to people who were going to kill him slowly, and I couldn't just stand there. You didn't know who I was. I knew you were a person. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she had to resist the urge to fill the silence. Then, you knew I was a person, he repeated, and something in his voice was so carefully neutral that she couldn't tell if it was contempt or something else entirely. He stood. He was taller than she'd registered, even at the auction she'd been operating on adrenaline then, and now in the gray morning light with no crowd and no chaos, the scale of him was simply a fact she had to adjust to. He crossed the space between them in one step, not enough to crowd her, but enough to make retreat a conscious choice, and he looked down at her with that jaw set. Unreadable expression she was starting to think might simply be his face. Let me explain how this works, he said quietly. You purchased a life. That is a transaction with weight in my world, more weight than you understand. A life bought is a debt that runs in both directions. He paused. You are responsible for the life you purchased. I am responsible for the life of the one who purchased it. This is not negotiable. This is not kindness. It is simply the way things are. I bought you for $1,200, Sylvia said. Yes. I was going to free you and leave. I know. That was the entire plan. It was a poor plan. There was that thing again, a glint behind his eyes. She was learning to identify as the closest he came to finding something genuinely funny. You don't leave my sight, he continued, and the almost humor was gone, replaced by something absolute and quiet and entirely serious. Not until I decide you're safe. Not until this is finished. You stay where I can see you. You do what I tell you when I tell you. And you do not make decisions that affect your safety without telling me first. That sounds a lot like a cage, Sylvia said. It sounds like survival, he said. The distinction matters. She wanted to argue. She had several arguments queued up, reasonable ones, about autonomy and consent, and the fact that she had not signed up for any of this, and that she had rights and a life and 2 exams next week, that she was now apparently not going to be able to sit for. But she looked at him, at the scars she had spent the night tending, at the marks on his wrists from the restraints, at the steadiness of a man who had been drugged and hurt and chained and had walked out of it with the same expression he'd walked into it with, and she thought about the parking garage, and the thing she'd seen there, and the reason she'd had $1,200 in cash in her wallet at a catering job. She thought about the bus ticket she'd never bought. Maybe she'd been a prisoner of something long before tonight. Fine, she said. Something in his expression shifted barely. Just barely, and he gave a single short nod. Good. He moved past her toward the window, toward the silver water and the morning light coming in off the bay. And Sylvia stood in the middle of the room that was and was not a cage, and breathed, slowly and deliberately, the way she'd learned to breathe when the ground beneath her had stopped being reliable. She was alive. He was alive. The sun was coming up over the water. She would start there. The days on the island had a suspended quality to them, like the world had agreed to hold its breath while they figured out what came next. Boxes arrived on the second day. She didn't know how. She hadn't asked. Hyun-Shik had made a single phone call in Korean at some point in the early morning hours, speaking in a low, clipped register that suggested the person on the other end understood that brevity was not optional. And by afternoon, a water taxi had docked at the private pier, and a man she didn't recognize had carried up 6 matte black boxes without making eye contact with either of them. Hyun-Shik set them at the foot of the bed. She'd been given a room with glass walls that faced the water, spare and cool and beautiful in the way of things that have never needed to try and left without explanation. She opened them that evening. The clothing inside was not what she would have chosen. It was better than what she would have chosen silk blouses in colors she would have called too bold and found herself reaching for anyway. Tailored trousers with a weight to them that spoke of serious fabric, a coat so dark it seemed to absorb the lamplight. At the bottom of the last box, wrapped in tissue paper, a pair of earrings, small dark stones set in blackened gold, understated in the way that only very expensive things manage to be. She sat with the earrings in her palm for a long moment. Then she put them on, looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, and felt simultaneously more herself and less herself than she had in years. The woman looking back at her had wide, watchful eyes and a jaw set at an angle that said, "I have stopped being surprised." She wasn't sure when that had happened. She wasn't sure she minded. She wore the coat to dinner. Hyun-Shik noticed. He noticed the way he noticed everything without appearing to, a glance that lasted a fraction of a second too long before his gaze returned to the files spread across the kitchen table, which she'd learned not to look at, because looking at them made him stop working and start watching her instead. And being watched by him required more composure than she always had available. "You didn't have to do all that," she said. "Your uniform was destroyed. I could have worn what you were wearing marked you as staff. In the world you're currently in, that's a liability." He turned a page without looking up. "Think of it as equipment." She sat down across from him with her tea and looked at the line of his shoulders, the way his sleeves were pushed to his elbows. He was always doing that. As if formality were something he permitted when the occasion demanded it, and shed the moment it didn't, and said, "Equipment. Yes, the earrings are equipment." A pause. The earrings were a separate decision. She didn't push it. She was learning when not to push. The gun appeared on the third day. He set it on the table between them after breakfast, a compact, matte finished thing that looked businesslike and unromantic, nothing like the weapons that lived in films, and looked at her. "Have you ever fired one?" "No. You will today." She had expected resistance in herself. She found, to her mild surprise, that there wasn't much. She had watched enough of the world she'd been dropped into to understand that the version of her that believed keeping her head down was sufficient protection had been operating on a logic the last several days, had thoroughly dismantled. She picked up the gun with both hands the way he showed her, and she listened, and she learned. He was a precise teacher. No excess, no false reassurance. He told her what to do, showed her once, and then corrected her when she was wrong. What she noticed, what she filed away quietly, was that he always positioned himself slightly behind her right shoulder when he was adjusting her stance, always within reach, always between her and the water, the trees, the open distance. She didn't think he was conscious of it. He taught her other things in the days that followed. How to read a room, not its decor, but its threat level. The exits, the people whose hands were hidden and the ones whose eyes moved too much. How to identify a lie, not by dramatic tells, but by the small misalignments between what a person's body was doing and what their voice was claiming. "People reveal themselves in the gap," he said once, and she thought that was probably the most he had ever said about human nature in a single sentence, and that it almost certainly applied to him too. She didn't say that. He slept less than any person she'd ever met and showed no signs of suffering for it. He drank coffee black and in quantity, and ate with the focused, utilitarian attention of someone who understood food as fuel and had long ago made peace with that. He did not watch television. He read physical books, in 2 languages, and once she caught the title of one and looked it up later on the tablet he'd provided her and found it was a dense philosophy text, uncompromising in its examination of power and obligation, which seemed exactly right. He did not talk about himself. She did not ask. What she did, instead, was watch and piece together, and try not to think about the fact that she had stopped counting the days as days she needed to escape. She found the file on the 8th day. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been looking for a pen, which had rolled behind the stack of folders on the corner of the desk while she'd been making notes about something unrelated. And when she moved the stack, a single sheet slid free and landed face up on the desk in front of her. It was a briefing document. She could tell from the format clean, spare, no names in the header, the kind of thing designed to look like nothing if found by the wrong person. She was clearly the wrong person. She read it anyway. It took her 40 seconds to understand what she was reading. It took another 20 to understand what it meant. The auction. The Obsidian Club. The auction of the damned that she had wandered into by accident with a tray of champagne and a wallet full of escape money. It had not been he had planned to be there. The document was sparse with detail, the way operational things are sparse, but the outline was clear. Infiltration via the auction as a staged capture. Positioned inside the venue to observe and identify the high table members funding the Red Vipers from the floor of the room itself. His own snipers had been positioned in the gallery above. There was a signal protocol, a specific sequence of movements with his bound hands at a precise moment that would have triggered his team to photograph every face in the room and neutralize the Red Viper lieutenants. Simultaneously, his retrieval had been planned for the chaos that followed, all of it meticulous, all of it prepared. And then, in handwriting she now recognized, a single added note at the bottom of the page. Bid disrupted signal protocol. Buyer unknown. Improvise. Sylvia set the page down very carefully. She stood up very carefully, and then she walked out of the office, and through the kitchen, and out onto the deck that faced the water. Because she needed the open air and the sound of the waves, and about 30 seconds before she said something she couldn't take back. She got 20 seconds. You read it. His voice came from the doorway behind. Her. Not a question. She turned around. He was leaning in the frame with his arms crossed, and his expression doing its usual nothing that focused. Complete attention that had no judgment in it, and no apology either. Just the clear-eyed acknowledgement of a situation as it was. You let yourself be captured, she said. Yes. The whole thing was a plan. The auction, the restraints, all of it. Yes. And my bid. Her voice did something she didn't authorize it to do, a slight fracture in the last word that she closed down immediately. I walked into the middle of an operation. You did. And you let me. Something moved across his face. Not apology. She was beginning to understand that apology was not a language he spoke fluently, but something that recognized the weight of what she was saying without deflecting from it. The signal was a specific hand movement, a sequence my team was watching for from the gallery. Your bid came at the exact moment I was about to execute it. I couldn't complete the sequence without making the movement visible to the guards standing over me. He paused. Without the signal, my snipers could not photograph the high table members or move on the Red Viper lieutenants. That was the entire purpose of the operation. Not my escape, I was capable of that the moment the restraints came off. The purpose was the intelligence. Your bid cost me that. So you kidnapped me. I removed you from a building that was about to become a war zone. That is the same thing. It is not. He pushed off the doorframe, and walked toward her. And she held her ground because the deck ended in a railing behind her, and also because she was angry enough that retreat felt wrong. If I had left you there, you would have been dead within the hour. The Red Vipers do not leave witnesses. He stopped in front of her. You were already a witness to something else. Before that night, she went very still. The parking garage, she said slowly. 3 months ago. His jaw tightened. The money in your wallet was not tip money. No. Her voice had gone quiet now, the anger not gone but reconfiguring itself around something more complicated. It was a bus ticket. I saw one of your rival's men kill someone in that garage. A man I later found out was a Geom-In accountant, someone who knew where the Red Viper's money came from. I didn't know any of that then. I just saw a murder I wasn't supposed to see, and I ran, and I've been running ever since. I know. You. She stopped. Started again. How long have you known about me? My people identified you from the parking garage security footage 2 months ago. You were a loose end the Red Vipers were already searching for. He said it without softening. You were never safe in that city. You were already tangled in this war before you ever walked through the wrong door. She looked at him, at the hard planes of his face and the steadiness of his eyes, and the way he stood like a man who had calculated every variable in the room and found the footing he needed. And she thought, our fates were tangled up before we even breathed the same air. She thought, I was never escaping this. She thought, I don't know how to feel about that. She opened her mouth to tell him exactly what she thought of being a variable in someone else's calculation. The window behind him exploded inward. The first thing Hyun-Shik did was put her on the floor. Not gently, there was no time for gently, but with the controlled force of someone who has one priority and is not interested in anything that isn't it. She hit the deck boards and he was already moving over her, low and fast, toward the interior of the house. She heard him in the hallway, sounds she couldn't translate, but understood in the way the body understands things, before the mind catches up, and then a shot, and a crash, and then silence that lasted exactly long enough for her heart to slam 4 times against her ribs. Stay low, his voice, from inside, alive. She stayed low. What followed was not the controlled violence of the auction house. This was close and ugly and real, the sound of the house being moved through by multiple people with intent, glass breaking somewhere toward the eastern wall, a grunt of impact she felt in her back teeth. She pressed herself against the base of the deck railing and controlled her breathing the way she'd been taught, and she ran through what she knew. One way down to the dock, the boat, the keys on a hook inside the kitchen door. She had also spent the last 2 days, on her own initiative, doing something else. In the house's utility room stocked for extended occupation, which meant cleaning solvents, chemical compounds, accelerants she recognized from 2 years of pre-med chemistry labs before she'd switched her focus to nursing. She had spent 2 quiet hours constructing a diversion device from materials anyone else would have. Overlooked. It sat in her jacket pocket now, a small sealed container, 2 compartments, a simple pressure trigger, crude, effective. The kind of thing that would not hurt anyone but would produce a significant amount of acrid smoke and a sound like a gunshot when activated. She had not told him. She had known he would not approve, and she had also known she needed something of her own. It was the way he'd gone quiet on day 6. Not his usual silence, but a different quality of it, tighter. The kind she'd learned to read as a man recalculating his odds that had sent her to the utility room. The man came over the railing from the water side. She activated the device first, dropped it toward the far end of the deck, and turned away, and in the 2 seconds of noise and sudden smoke that followed, she moved exactly the way Hyun-Shik had shown her. Both hands, breath out. The man went down. Her hands were shaking when she lowered them. She filed that away for later and moved toward the door. Hyun-Shik was in the kitchen when she came through. He was the only one standing. He had taken a knife to his right side. She could see it in the careful way he was holding himself, one hand pressed to his ribs, his weight distributed with deliberate precision. Her gun was in her hands. His sat on the counter where he'd set it down to deal with the last man. He looked at her. He looked at the gun. He looked back at her face. The deck? He said. Clear. I used a device, smoke and percussion. Built it from the utility room supplies. A pause. Something moved behind his eyes too fast to read. You're all right. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. Yes. She crossed to him and put her hand flat against his right side without asking permission, pressing through the fabric to feel the depth of it. He let her stood very still and let her work. And it occurred to her, with her hand pressed to his ribs and his breath coming measured and controlled above her head, that this was the closest they had physically been since the auction hall. Since he had stood behind her with his arms around her waist and looked out at a room full of people who wanted them both dead. She looked up. He was already looking down. The gap between what she'd been about to say, the wound needs pressure, we need to move, how did they find us, and what actually happened was very small, a matter of inches. A matter of the particular quality of a silence that has been building for 8 days and has finally found the crack it needs. He kissed her the way he did everything, with complete, unhesitating commitment, one hand coming up to the back of her jaw with a careful precision that was both controlled and devastating. She kissed him back with her whole self, 8 days of fear and anger, and something she'd been refusing to name, finally finding somewhere to go. When they broke apart, the kitchen was quiet. Somewhere on the water, a boat engine was fading toward distance. "How did they find the island?" she said. His expression went flat. "The Bentley. There was a tracker on it placed before the auction as a contingency, in case I escaped the building through an unplanned route. I should have swept the car at the dock." He said it without self-recrimination, simply a fact being logged and filed. "There is also a mole in my outer network. Someone fed them our location once the tracker confirmed the dock. That gets handled when we return. The safe house is compromised." "Yes." His hand was still at her jaw. He was looking at her with an expression she now had a name for the one that lived underneath the calculation, that he hadn't meant for her to see. "When this is over," he said, "we'll revisit this conversation." "Which conversation?" "All of them." He picked up his gun from the counter, and Sylvia Kern, who had come to this island as a mistake and was leaving it as something she didn't have a word for yet, followed him out into the dark. They spent 3 nights at a secondary location, a sparse, anonymous apartment on the mainland that smelled like cigarettes and someone else's emergency, one of the places Hyun-Shik kept specifically for situations that had gone wrong. It was there that his contact arrived on the second morning, with the materials Sylvia had requested without explanation or apology. And it was there, at a kitchen table that had seen better decades, that she built the second device. They went back to the city on the 3rd night. She wore black. He wore black. They did not discuss this. It simply happened, the way a number of things between them simply happened now, as if the negotiation had occurred somewhere beneath language and they were both just receiving the results. The Obsidian Club was lit from within like a golden lantern, the same chandeliers blazing, the same opulent haze that had no memory of what it had witnessed 2 weeks ago. The Red Vipers had taken the building as a trophy, celebrating in the very room where they'd tried to sell Gan Hyun-Shik to his death, which struck Sylvia as either deeply arrogant or deeply stupid. And she was starting to understand those were often the same thing. She went in through the service entrance. She had worked a catering shift in this building before. She knew where the corridors ran, and how the kitchen connected to the main hall, and which doors were alarmed, and which were simply closed. She had spent the boat ride studying the schematic Hyun-Shik's contact had provided, and memorized it the way she memorized pharmacological charts, completely, without sentiment. "They will not recognize you," Hyun-Shik had said before they separated at the dock. "You are not the woman they expect." She hadn't argued, because he was right. The woman who had walked into this building 2 weeks ago clutching a tray and a wallet full of hope was not the woman walking into it now. She had 2 things in her jacket. Her gun, on the left, and the second device on the right, larger than the first, built over 2 days at the mainland apartment from materials sourced through Hyun-Shik's contact. This one was designed to do more than cause confusion. It would take out every light source in the main hall simultaneously, and fill the room with enough chemical haze to collapse visibility to 0 for approximately 90 seconds. Long enough. The main hall was full. 24 men at least, the Red Viper leadership and their seconds, toasting with stolen champagne in their rivals' chairs. At the head of the room, Jang Woo-sok held court with the loose, expansive confidence of a man who believed the war was already won. Sylvia walked in through the service door and did not stop walking. She crossed toward the bar the way Hyun-Shik had taught her to move in rooms like this. Not invisibly, but quietly, with a purpose that satisfied the eye without inviting scrutiny. She could feel attention shifting, a few heads turning, the natural human response to a woman who moved like she belonged there. She reached the bar, picked up an open bottle of champagne, turned slowly, scanning the room with the particular expression of someone looking for a specific person, and made eye contact with Jang Woo-sok's second-in-command for exactly long enough to plant a question in his mind about who she was and why she was looking at him. 50 seconds. She set the bottle down and reached. Into her right jacket pocket, she heard nothing from Hyun-Shik's direction. She didn't need to. She had been in this room when it changed before, and she knew the specific quality of air that shifts when he decides to move. She triggered the device. The lights died. The haze rolled out fast and chemical and absolute, and the room above her became what it became. She dropped below the bar line and pressed herself flat, and ran through the periodic table the way she'd once run through it in an exam, steady and methodical, her heart rate measured, and she waited. It took less time than she expected. When the emergency lighting bled on dim and red and honest in a way the chandeliers had never been, she stood up slowly and looked. Hyun-Shik stood at the far end of the room. He was not unscathed. He would never be. She understood that now, had understood it since the night she'd read the map of his scars and realized that surviving was simply the thing he did, over and over. As a matter of practice rather than luck, his jacket was gone. There was blood at his collar, old and new. But he stood with the particular stillness of a man who has finished a thing, and the room around him confirmed it. Jang Woo-suk was among them. She could see him from where she stood, which meant it was over. He looked across the space between them, over the wreckage of the Red Viper's last celebration, through the red light and the settling haze. She looked back. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to negotiate in that moment, no terms, no distance. Just the fact of each other, alive, in the same room where it had started. He crossed to her. He brought her to the center of the room. Not the center of chaos. The chaos was done, receding. The sound of his men arriving through the building's various corridors like a tide coming in. The center of the room itself, the same raised platform where he had stood in chains 2 weeks ago. The gavel lay on the auction block, untouched, where someone had left it as a joke or a trophy, or simply forgotten it existed. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, his ruined, blood-stained jacket, and produced an envelope. He held it out to her. She looked at it, looked at him, took it. Inside was cash, banded, ordered. An amount she could feel without counting was not $1,200, was not close to $1,200. Was $1,200 multiplied by a number her brain declined to calculate, because calculating it would require accepting that this was real. That's, she started, what you're owed. Hyun-Shik, plus interest. Something in his voice was different, still low, still measured, still contained within those precise registers he never seemed to leave, but underneath it, a seam of something that had no armor on it. Something that had decided, in the last 2 weeks, to exist. You can go, he said. The city is safe. The men who wanted you dead are dead. You can take the money, go back to your apartment, go back to nursing school, finish your exams. A pause. I will ensure no one touches you. He did not say. The high table members who had fled the building that night were already exposed. Woo-suk's second-in-command had given 3 names before the end. The way men always give names when the calculation changes, and 3 names were enough to pull the rest of the threads stripped of their enforcers and running out of places to hide. He would deal with them, one by one, in the weeks that followed. He did not say. The mole in his outer network had been identified and removed before they ever boarded the boat back to the city. The man had gone silent within an hour of the safe house attack, which was itself the answer. Because only guilty men go quiet when the shooting starts. He did not say any of the things that were already in motion, because none of them were the point. The point was standing in front of him with an envelope in her hands and a choice in front of her. Her eyes moved over him. At the man standing in a room full of his own wreckage, jacket gone, blood at his collar, hair broken from its careful arrangement, who had endured withdrawal and a bullet graze and a knife wound and waged a war in the last 2 weeks, who had taught her to shoot and to read a room and to move through danger without flinching, who had kissed her in a compromised kitchen like a man finally losing an argument he'd been winning for days, who had the most carefully controlled face she'd ever studied and the most legible eyes she'd ever learned, who had said, "I know you can," with a certainty that had not been performance. She looked at the envelope in her hands. She thought about the bus ticket she'd never bought, and the city she'd been trying to leave, and the nursing school she would go back to, and the life that was still there, intact. Waiting, she had checked in one of the brief windows of signal on the island, and her professors had been understanding about her absence, and her apartment had not been disturbed. and the ordinary machinery of her ordinary life had simply continued without her, patient and available. She thought about all of that. Then, she set the envelope down on the auction block, on top of the gavel, very deliberately. "Keep the interest," she said. "I'll take the original." He looked at the envelope, looked at her. "Sylvia, the city needs a queen." She said it simply, without theater, the way she said things she meant. "You told me that safety isn't given. It's taken." She paused. "I'm taking it." What moved across his face then was the thing underneath the calculation, the thing he hadn't meant for her to see, that she'd been seeing anyway since the first morning on the island, when she'd caught him watching her at the window with his coffee going cold in his hand, and his expression entirely unguarded for approximately 4 seconds. Before he noticed her noticing, he reached out and took her face in his hands with that same precise, unhesitating care, and he kissed her in the center of the room where he'd once stood in chains, with the gavel and the money and the wreckage of his enemies around them, and the chandeliers blazing gold above them like they had never witnessed anything else. Around them, his men had gone very still. When he lifted his head, he kept his hands where they were, her face tilted up toward his, and he looked at her for a long moment with those dark, measuring eyes that were finally, completely not measuring anything at all. "You spent your last dollar," he said quietly. "I know. On me. You were worth it." She held his gaze. "Don't make me regret it." That glint moved through his expression, the one she'd first seen in the auction hall, the one she now knew was the closest he came to joy, and he pressed his forehead briefly to hers. 1 breath. 2. Then he straightened and took her hand and led her out of the room that had started everything, into the rest of what came next. Can Hyun-Shik tell the real Sylvia from the woman who was sent to replace her, the one who studied her every move, learned her voice, memorized her scars? And what dark secret connects these two women who share the same face? Smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you do not want to miss what happens next. This story is about to get so much more twisted. Drop a comment, do you think their love can survive this ultimate test? Like this video if you're completely obsessed with this forbidden romance that keeps getting more dangerous by the chapter. The next episode drops soon, and trust me, you are not ready for the truth about who Sylvia Kern really is. See you in the next one, if the real Sylvia survives.